Hey everyone, it's Nightharo here, and today we're updating the Brittleden guide for you. So this build has gotten even better since the last patch with update 41, and it's only going to get better with update 42. We'll start off here with just talking about our skills, and then after that we'll move into some optional skills, then we'll talk about gear and setups and all that good stuff. As always, note that this is a reference guide. This is not meant to be the card you see behind me is not meant to be the end-all be-all. It's just supposed to be for a reference. And for those of you who are like, Nightharo, get out of the way, I can't see the screen. I am working on a website so that these will be someplace you can easily access them. For right now, the best place to get them is either from the community tab here on YouTube or at the Discord. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the skills. First up here is going to be Subterranean Assault. This is a major source of our damage. It's one of the primary skills we're going to use. We want to make sure that we keep this up at all times, and also that we make sure that it ticks all the way down. So this will actually go off twice. After we've cast it, it'll go off after 3 seconds, and then it'll go off again. Make sure you see the shocks go off. You don't want to recast this early. If you're practicing, you can kind of get used to it, but just make sure you don't cast this early because you'll miss the second tick of damage, and then I'll make the skill do half as much damage as it otherwise would, which will make it, a very bad skill to use. So make sure it goes all the way off, make sure it ticks all the way down before you recast it. But generally speaking, you'll prioritize this first or second in our rotation, depending on what's going on. Our second skill up here is going to be Barb Trap. Barb Trap, it's where we get our minor force from, which increases our critical damage by 10%. That's why we want to use this skill. It does decent amount of damage as well, but that's our primary reason here. After that is going to be our main spammable. We're going to be using Frost Reach. We're going to be running the Master's Destro Staff, the Ice Staff, with this build, and so note that procs for only a handful of seconds after we cast Frost Reach, and that's a major source of our damage. So we're going to be casting this early and often. We want to make sure that every 4 seconds at least, every 4th skill cast, that we are casting this ability for maximum damage. If you're parsing low, usually that's what it is. So this will be our main priority, is casting this once every 4 seconds, and then shocks will be our next DPS priority. After that, we have Cutting Dive. Cutting Dive is going to be a good source of burst damage for us to help dot up targets, and then they'll have a bit of a damage over time as well. And on other builds, you can actually use Cutting Dive as your main spammable, but since we're running, mostly a Frost build, that's how we're using it. Cutting Dive will also put an enemy off balance if you cast it while at range beyond, I believe, 7 meters. This is really useful for whenever you're solo running around open overworld, for proccing this off balance on various targets so that you don't actually need to swap out Exploiter. Now you can do something else if you'd like, but it's just kind of a nice thing to have and something to keep in mind with this skill. After that, we have Winter's Revenge. This is another ice damaging skill. So far we've only got 2 on our front bar, but we'll have more on our back. This is just a really nice AoE skill. We can cast it at range and it helps keep up brittle. I will note too, with this build, almost everything is ranged. The only thing that's not ranged on this build is our Barb Trap, and we can morph to the other version of that to make this a 100% ranged build. And it'll work really well for doing a lot of different things, running portals and Cloud Rest, anytime you need to be ranged. It's a really easy build to change up. And then, of course, for our ultimate, normally we are going to be running our bear. If for some reason we either don't want to be using our bear because it's a short burst fight, there's a lot of situations, unfortunately, that comes up, or if we're running some sort of arena or something like that and we're having to worry about our bear dying all the time, then you want to swap out and you'll go with Flawless Dawnbreaker from the Fighter's Guild skill line. We use this mostly for the passive from that skill line. Just having it on our bar will increase our weapon and spell damage. However, if you ever need to use it and you're in towards the end of a fight and you need a bit of burst damage and you're not going to get enough for your major, Destro ult or something else on your back bar, then you can go ahead and cast it and it'll still work quite well. Now moving on to our back bar, I will note that I'm just recommending a ice staff on our back bar on this build. Previously, I've done, you can use a two-hander, and I've explained that. I've gotten some feedback that sometimes that can be a little bit too complicated for people, so I haven't included it on the card. I will note, if you want to do a two-hander, you absolutely can. Just swap to the two-handed greatsword. Instead of Wall of Elements, you'll be using Stampede, and then instead of Caltrops, you'll just be using Carve. Nothing much else to it. But because we are a Brittleden, and because ice damage is getting even better with the way the status effects have changed, and again, it's only going to get better next patch, we're going to go with the Wall of Elements with an Ice Staff, a Maelstrom Ice Staff on our back bar. And then for our second skill here, we're going to be using Caltrops. Now, I will note, if you need AoE Breach, if you're in Trash, or if you're doing like Maelstrom Arena, or you're doing something like that where you need AoE Breach on a bunch of targets, or you want AoE Breach on a bunch of targets, use Razor Caltrops. Otherwise, you want to use the other morph because it does more damage, and that's just all there is to it. it, nothing else super exciting. When the next patch drop, update 42, and we can actually craft, spell crafting gets here, we should, if everything goes as planned, we should be able to add more ice damage to our build, and that'll actually change up our build considerably. Caltrops is definitely one of the skills we can drop in that situation for another ice damaging ability. You just want something that does the most damage over time. Pretty straightforward, just swap it out here fairly directly. And if you can swap out multiple skills, then actually on our front bar, our cutting dive, that would be the other skill that we would swap out here. Ideally, you would choose a stamina costing ice damage ability if you can make that, because otherwise you're going to have problems with Magicka Sustain on this build. Right now, as it stands, it's pretty nice, even solo with Sustain, not a problem at all. I've tried it out in Maelstrom Arena, and it's been great so far. Our next skill here is going to be both our self-heal and another great damaging ability. So this is Arctic Blast, and it does only apply in a short area around us. So do keep in mind, if you do go full range and you're very far from your targets, you only want to leave this on your bar if you're going to be using it for a self-heal, or if sometimes you are going to be in melee range. Otherwise, it's not actually going to be able to hit our target. And one of the really nice things about Arctic Blast is it has a really high chance of applying the chilled status effect. I know both this and Winter's Revenge both say they have a higher chance. It's much higher on Arctic Blast than it is with Winter's Revenge. I've tested this out quite a bit myself. And then our fourth skill here is going to be our Fetcher Infection. So we're using this both because it's a good damage over time ability, but also because it provides minor vulnerability. Minor vulnerability increases our target's damage taken by 5%. If you're on a Warden, typically your group will be counting on you to keep this ability up. Now, if you go solo, if you're in solo content, you're in some sort of arena, AoE, overland, something like that, I would strongly recommend you consider switching this morph to the stamina morph for two reasons. One is it'll do AoE damage, which is nice to have. And then the other thing is that it'll cost stamina. And when you're overland and you're by yourself, you're not in a group, even in certain 4-man dungeons, if your group's, if your healer's not in Symphony of Blades or something like that, you might have some Magicka issues. And switching this to the stamina morph will definitely help you out with that. It's a little bit less damage. It's really only the second cast of the Magicka version. So again, whenever you're in dungeons, whenever you're overland, you're probably killing most things before it really even matters. So the stamina morph is just going to be better in all those situations. And then our last skill here on our bar is going to be Elemental Susceptibility. We're using this because the status effect procs. So it'll help us proc Chilled, which does a bit of extra damage, but it'll also proc several other status effects. It doesn't cost anything. So that's one of the reasons we can kind of get away with having so many Magicka costing abilities on our bar, is that we do have a few stamina abilities, and then we have this one that doesn't cost anything. So it works out really well. Again, if you're in a situation where you need to swap out some skills, first thing you're going to want to swap out is going to be our caltrops, and then after that it kind of just depends a bit, so just keep that in mind. Depending on the situation, if you have some source of minor force, you would swap out Barb Trap, and if you didn't have a source of minor force, then it would probably be our Fetcher that we'd want to swap out if we needed an extra heal or some other survival ability, which we'll talk about when we get to our flex skills. And then on our back bar, of course, we have our bear again. You do need to double bar your bear to make sure it stays out at all times. You do cast this actively whenever you get the ultimate to do so. That'll help your damage, and it's really important in execute as well. Now, if you're in one of those situations where you need burst damage, and so the bear is not going to help, or you need a lot of AoE damage, then you're going to swap to something like a Destro Staff, or the best thing is actually the Mage's Guild Shooting Star. But the issue with Shooting Star is you need Mage's Guild maxed out, which I don't recommend everybody go do. It's kind of a pain, and it's one of those things that it's kind of made there so that you want to go buy it from the Crown Store, and I don't really like encouraging people to do that. It's not that much of a damage loss. You can run Northern Storm instead, or even the Destro Staff Ultimate is just fine, and it does maybe a little bit less damage, but it's not that big of a deal. It really isn't. All right, now let's go ahead and move on to our useful skills. So first up here is going to be either Deceptive Predator or Bird of Prey. Both morphs of this skill, otherwise just referred to as wings, both morphs of this skill are useful. One morph will give you minor evasion, which will reduce your damage taken from AoE abilities, and the other morph will give you minor berserk, which is more useful whenever you're out solo, because you won't have that coming from a healer, which where you get it in most like optimized group content. This is just a really nice ability to be able to move faster. That is incredibly helpful. It's also just kind of a quality of life thing if you're running around overland, but if you need to kite mobs in any kind of situation, it's really nice to have. And the fact that you can have it on your bar and also get this passive ability from it, either reduce damage or taken or increase damage done, is also kind of nice to have. So pretty important skill here. After that, we have our Frost Cloak. Both morphs of this actually provide major resolve for your group in an AoE. One provides it in a much larger area, so if your group is really spread out. If you're in PvP, depending on what you're doing, you might want the larger morph. If you're just worried about yourself and just worried about surviving, or if you're in an optimized group with friends and they know to stand close together, then you can go with the other morph, and it also gives you minor protection to further reduce your damage taken by 5%. And I'm sorry, major resolve is going to decrease your damage taken by about 9%. So one of the first things you do if you're worried about dying overland and what have you, or in an arena or something like that, first thing is put on Ring of the Pale Order. That's absolutely the first thing you do if you have it. That'll keep you alive, more than anything else. The second thing, if you're worried about one hits and what have you, then it's going to be to put on Frost Cloak. The reduction of almost 15% damage taken is huge. It doesn't seem like that much. It's only 15%. Turns out to be quite large and pretty significant. So that's the second thing I would do after putting on Ring of the Pale Order. And then the third thing is probably going to be to put on something like Resolving Vigor. Resolving Vigor will also give you minor resolve, which reduces your damage taken by another 4.5%. So you're getting almost a little bit less, about 18, 19, close to 20% reduced damage taken with all of those buffs on. So pretty significant. Will certainly help you keep one-shots from killing you. And then our last two here are a little bit less significant than the first three we talked about, and that's going to be our Shimmering Shield. Either morph of this is good. It just blocks projectiles. Certain places, that's huge. Most places, it doesn't really matter. The Ash Titan in Veteran Rockgrove is one place. The Warrior in Hellraw Citadel, whenever he's doing Starfall, those are all considered missile attacks. So just learning what is a missile attack, what isn't, using your Shimmering Shield can be pretty huge and can help keep you alive and kind of makes it easy mode as opposed to like, oh no, don't die, don't die. Even with the Ice Staff. And then after that, we have our Betting Etch, which is going to be a source of sustain for us, as well as giving us a buff. But the main reason we use it is for the sustain. So if you're overland and for some reason you're having problems with sustain, we'll talk about that. But putting on the Netch is one way of dealing with that. All right, I think that's it for skills. Let's go ahead and move on and we'll talk about gear. All right, so for our gear, we're going to stick with the theme as much as we can. For our trial set, we're going to do Whirl of the Depths, and then we're going to do the Velothi Urmage Amulet with this build, and then we're going to do 2 pieces of critical. You can use anything you want, absolutely anything you want. And then for our monster set, we'll go with Iceheart. Our front bar, we'll use the Master's Ice Staff, and then our back bar, it'll be the Maelstrom Ice Staff, okay? So it's kind of a weird build. So we have our front bar, back bar, arena weapons. We want to make sure we have our Wall of Elements in our back bar for the Maelstrom, and then we want to make sure we're using Frost Reach on our front bar for the Master's Ice Staff. That leaves us, we put on a Mythic, we put on a monster set, we put on a 5-piece set, and it leaves us with kind of 2 pieces left over. So we put on 2 pieces of crit because that's kind of the best thing that we can do. I will note, if you do not have these mythics, or if you're looking to farm them, or if you just don't want to run this kind of build, I'm sorry, not mythics, I mean arena sets, then you don't need to. You could run a traditional setup with this build and it would work just fine. What I would recommend is probably still running Maelstrom Ice Staff back bar, run a front bar Whirl of the Depths Ice Staff, and just front bar that set. And then you can drop your monster set, one piece of crit, Velothi Urmage Amulet, and then a second set. Something like Reliquin is going to be the best thing for single target damage. And then I've got quite a few other sets kind of listed here. Onsol's Torment is a good all-around set to have for like a trial set. You don't need to do anything. It just always works. So that's kind of nice. And then Overland or in certain arenas, you do find yourself interrupting a lot. So it can actually be kind of best in slot there. Solzan, also really good. Kind of for the same reasons. It's honestly better than Onsol in most situations, but you do have to make sure you're killing things and collecting souls, and that's not always possible. So that would be another option you could do. And then Zaan for our monster set, you could also go with that instead of going with Iceheart. I recommend Iceheart only in situations where you would use Kilt. Because the shield, if it gets eaten, then it means you're not doing damage. But with the changes to Brittle and everything else, I think Iceheart is a great option. And I mean that for maximum damage, as long as you're not taking damage. If you're solo and you do want the shield, Iceheart still really good. But you could also use Zaan. So just realize, for your main set, if you're running the basic build that I recommend with only 1 5-piece set, do make sure it's a trial set that you're running. That can be Whirl of the Depths, that can be Onsol's Torment, it can be Reliquin. If you're parsing, you'll get the most damage probably running Reliquin, but just keep that in mind. For crafted and overland sets, if you are just starting this build and you don't have anything, you can do Order's Wrath. Order's Wrath is a crafted set. You can craft it any way you want, so that's really helpful. And then I would pair it with Frostbite. Frostbite is an overland set. It drops from Blackwood. It's really nice. It increases our frost damage by a significant amount. It's a little bit confusing. I I think I've gotten some questions about it. So the first 8% increases all of your frost damage. So anything that says it does frost damage, that's what increases. The next 4%, it affects targets that are chilled. And then you have another 2% that affects targets that have brittle on them. You're going to have all that stuff up 100% of the time. You don't really need to worry about it. The main thing to keep in mind with Frostbite is that in the next patch, again, whenever we can add a frost skill on our bar, then it's going to be even better. And honestly, it might become best in slot or basically best in slot. It might be one of those things that's niche for Brittleden that you can run it 100% of the time. As it stands, it's still really, really good in trash. And actually one of the things, if you wanted to run a different trash setup, you could run it because you can stack a lot of abilities that just do ice damage with it. But currently as it stands, it loses about 10 to 15k damage off of the maximum from running some other better set that applies to all of our damage done. Because if you look at these skills, not everything is obviously ice damage. And so Frostbite is not really going to buff those. We're only going to get the 6% damage increase from that, not the 8% on top of that. So just keep that in mind. But fingers crossed, spellcrafting is coming and that we'll be able to actually swap out those skills and be full Brittleden, full Ice Warden on the next patch. All right, after that, for our weapons, on our front bar, our staffs, we're always going to make sure they're charged. That helps us apply the chilled status effect, which increases our damage done. On our back bar, we're always going to go with infused with a weapon damage enchant. For our jewelry, we're going to go with bloodthirsty with spell damage enchants. Just the best thing to do for damage. And then our body, we're going all divines. Again, we're typically aiming for about 5 pieces of medium if we can. 4 is okay if we're running World Adepts or some other light armor set. For our blue CP, slottable, we're going with Wrathful Strikes, Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and then Exploiter. Since we can apply off balance with our Cutting Dive, we can generally speaking leave Exploiter on our bar at all times. If we, for some reason, we're having problems or we're in melee, you can also swap that out and go with something like Thaumatology, and that's going to work really well. It's a very small damage decrease. So just keep that in mind. For a red CP, it's a choose your own adventure as always. Things that I really like: Fortified, that increases your armor and reduces your damage taken therefore. Celerity gives you a little bit of extra speed whenever you're in combat. That's always nice. Expert Evasion gives you a free roll dodge. Saved my life so many times I never take it off my bar. And then Rejuvenation for a bit of extra recovery. And then for our Mundus, we're going with a Thief, and this is a Magicka build, so we're just putting everything in Magicka. For our race, I recommend personally either a high or dark elf. Dark elves are nice because you can swap them between magic and stamina without having a race change or worry about that you're losing, 5% potentially off the top of your damage from being, a non-optimal race. Mine is actually a high elf, my Brittleden, and that's because I actually have a wood elf for my stamina version. So, it's whatever you want to run. Honestly, if you're running the most suboptimal race, remember it's not going to be more than about a 5% damage decrease. And that's if you're doing theoretical, like max damage. Okay. So it might even be less for you. For our potions, we're going to go with Spell Power Potions, ideally the ones that provide not the trash pots you find overland, but the ones that provide you with the 3 different buffs. I'm sorry, they're called the same thing. Blame sauce, not me. For food, you have options here. If you need health, then you're going to go with something like Witch Mother's Potent Brew, which will give you both max health, max magicka, and magicka recovery. That's going to be the most ideal thing. If you find you don't need magicka recovery, which you might with this build, depending on exactly what you're running and your setup, you can also go with something like Sugar Skulls for extra health, which will also give you most of the benefit of having a max resource food, while also giving you a bit more survivability. Sanguine Apples, Ghastly Eyeball. So, Sanguine Apples will give you the most max mag, and that's best if you're just trying to go with max damage. And then Ghastly Eyeball will give you the most max mag while also giving you some magicka recovery. Just go with whatever you need. If you're dying, obviously go with more health food. If you're not having a problem with that, or you're having more problems with sustain, or you want to eke out a little bit more damage, drop the max health food and go with something that provides you with a little bit more max resources, because that does give you the equivalent of weapon and spell damage. Now, if you have any questions about this build, please feel free to drop in the comments down below or come by the That Wasn't the Boss Discord server. We have help channels, a lot of people there that can help answer questions, people that know even more than I do. If you have questions specifically about this build, I'm going to be doing some sort of live stream. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, running through some sort of solo content or something like that. And if you have questions, just keep an eye out on the channel and come join that, and you can ask all the questions you want. I can explain everything you need to know about how to fix your sustain, or if you have problems with stamina versus Magicka, or if you want to swap it and make this a stamina build, you can absolutely do that with a hybrid meta now. And once we've done that, if this is, months in the future here, just look in the description of this video and I'll make sure to leave a link to it down below. But anyways, I think that's it for today. Appreciate everybody watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.